March 23, 1984. Syracuse, New York. A quiet residential street erupts into chaos as police cruisers surround a modest two-story house. Neighbors peer from their windows, confusion etched on their faces. They've known the man who lives here for years. Quiet, kept to himself, never caused trouble. But today, Marcus Gregg is being led out in handcuffs. And what police found inside his home would answer a question that had haunted this community for 13 years, while simultaneously asking 1,000 more. 2 hours outside the city, at a farmhouse slowly being reclaimed by nature, forensic teams work carefully around a shallow grave. The remains have already been removed, but investigators comb through dirt and debris, searching for answers. One of the detectives, a man named Robert Henderson, stands apart from the scene. His hands shake as he lights a cigarette. He's been on this case since day one. March 15th, 1971. The day 2 6-year-old boys vanished without a trace. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of New York's most heartbreaking cold cases. A case that would span over a decade, destroy families, shake a community's faith, and ultimately reveal a truth so disturbing that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend it. This is the story of David and Donald Hicken. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. We cover cases like this every week, giving victims the voices they deserve and exploring the dark corners of the human psyche. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Trust me, you'll want to stay for this entire journey. Let's rewind 13 years, back to 1971. Richard Nixon is president. The Vietnam War dominates headlines. And in Syracuse, New York, a city of about 200,000 people nestled in the heart of New York State, life moves at a comfortable, predictable pace. The Hicken family embodied the American dream. Michael Hicken, age 34, was a hospital administrator at Syracuse Memorial Hospital. Respected, hardworking, the kind of man who wore a suit to work every day and coached Little League on weekends. His wife, Rachel, was 32. A devoted mother who had given up her teaching career to raise their boys. Friends described her as warm, nurturing, the kind of woman who baked cookies for every school function and knew every child in the neighborhood by name. And then there were David and Donald, identical twins, 6 years old, impossible to tell apart unless you knew them well. David had a small birthmark behind his left ear that was the only physical difference. But their personalities? Distinct. David was the cautious one. Thoughtful. The boy who'd stand at the edge of the playground, observing before jumping in. Donald was his opposite, fearless, always the first to try the highest slide, to climb the tallest tree. He pulled his brother into adventures. They were inseparable. Two halves of a whole. The Hickens had enrolled their boys in Oakmont Academy, an elite private school on the outskirts of Syracuse. It wasn't cheap. Tuition ran about $1,500 a year, a fortune in 1971. But Michael and Rachel wanted the best for their sons. Small class sizes, individual attention, safety, or so they thought. March 15th, 1971. Started like any other Monday. Rachel made the boys their favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast cut into triangles. David ate carefully. Donald rushed through his meal, eager to get to school because his class was starting a project on dinosaurs, and he'd brought his toy T-Rex for show and tell. Rachel kissed both boys goodbye at 8:15 a.m. She watched them climb into the car with Michael, their matching blue backpacks bouncing as they ran. It was the last time she'd see one of her sons alive. At Oakmont Academy, the day progressed normally. Classes, recess, lunch in the cafeteria where the twins sat together, as always, trading items from their lunchboxes, Donald's apple for David's pudding cup. Their teacher, Mrs. Patricia Summers, would later tell police that both boys seemed happy that day. Normal. They participated in class. Donald gave an enthusiastic presentation about his T-Rex. David helped another student with a math problem. At 2:45 p.m., the final bell rang. Most students at Oakmont were picked up by parents or took the school bus. But the Hicken twins had a different routine. Michael couldn't leave work that early, so Rachel would drive to the school at 3:15 p.m. to collect them. The boys knew to wait in the designated pickup area, a covered pavilion near the main entrance, where teachers supervised until all children were collected. But when Rachel Hicken pulled up to Oakmont Academy at 3:17 p.m., David and Donald weren't there. At first, Rachel wasn't worried. The boys probably went to the bathroom. Or maybe they were helping their teacher clean up the classroom. They did that sometimes. She parked and walked into the building. The hallways were mostly empty now, just a few stragglers heading to after-school activities. Rachel found Mrs. Summers in her classroom, erasing the chalkboard. "Hi, Patricia. Have you seen the boys?" Mrs. Summers turned, confused. "They didn't meet you outside?" "No. They weren't at the pavilion." The teacher's face shifted slightly, not quite concern yet, but something close. "They left with everyone else. I saw them walk out with the other children, around 250. The two women hurried back outside, checked the pavilion again, the bathrooms, the library, the gymnasium. No David, no Donald. By 3:30 p.m., the school's administration had been alerted. By 3:45 p.m., they were searching the entire campus, every classroom, every closet, the boiler room, the athletic fields. At 4 p.m., someone called the police. And at 4:07 p.m., when Michael Hicken answered his office phone and heard his wife's panicked voice, the nightmare officially began. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. How many of you have been following this channel for a while? And how many are brand new? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you're finding value in this deep dive, that subscribe button is right there. It's free. It helps the channel tremendously, and it ensures you don't miss the conclusion to this case. All right, let's get back to March 15th, 1971. Syracuse police arrived at Oakmont Academy within 15 minutes of the call. Detective Robert Henderson was among the first responders. At 38 years old, he'd been with the department for 12 years and had worked everything from burglaries to homicides. But missing children cases? Those hit different. Henderson would later say in an interview, "The moment I saw Rachel Hicken's face, I knew this wasn't kids playing hide and seek. A mother knows, and she knew something was terribly wrong." The initial search focused on the school grounds and immediate surrounding area. 47 acres of property, wooded areas, a small pond, maintenance buildings, parking lots. Police brought in dogs. The canines picked up the twins' scent in the main building, traced it outside to the pavilion, and then nothing. The trail went cold at the edge of the parking lot, as if the boys had simply vanished into thin air. By nightfall, over 100 volunteers had joined the search. Parents from the school, neighbors, local college students. They combed through nearby woods with flashlights, calling the boys names. David, Donald. Nothing but silence and the rustle of wind through bare March trees. Michael and Rachel Hicken were beside themselves. Michael kept repeating, "They wouldn't just leave. They know better. Something happened. Someone took them." Rachel couldn't speak. She just clutched a small, stuffed bear that belonged to Donald, her body shaking with silent sobs. The first 48 hours in a missing persons case are critical. Everyone knows this. Evidence degrades, memories fade. If someone had taken the boys, they were getting further away with every passing hour. Detective Henderson set up a command center at the school. Phone lines were installed, tip lines established. By the morning of March 16th, the FBI had been called in. This was now a potential kidnapping case. Investigators began the painful process of interviewing everyone connected to the school: teachers, staff, the janitor, the cafeteria workers, the groundskeeper, the maintenance team, every parent who'd been on campus that day, and, as is standard procedure in cases like this, Michael and Rachel Hicken themselves were questioned extensively. Statistics show that in cases of missing children, family members are often responsible. It's a grim reality that investigators can't ignore. So while it tore the Hickens apart emotionally, detectives had to verify their alibis, examine their finances for signs of stress or motive, and even search their home. Michael had been at the hospital all day. Security footage and multiple witnesses confirmed it. Rachel had been home, then running errands. She'd stopped at a grocery store around 2 p.m. The cashier remembered her. She'd been at a gas station at 2:45 p.m. Credit card receipt proved it. Neither parent was involved. But then, who was? The media descended on Syracuse like locusts. By March 17th, the disappearance of the Hicken twins was front-page news not just locally, but nationally. Twin boys vanish from elite school. Syracuse twins disappear without trace. FBI joins search for missing brothers. Television crews set up camp outside Oakmont Academy. Reporters ambushed the Hickens every time they left their house. The story had everything the media loved: wealthy family, prestigious school, photogenic identical twins, and a complete mystery. Rachel Hicken made a tearful plea on television. "Please, if anyone has seen our boys, if anyone knows anything, they're just babies. Please bring them home." The phones at the tip line rang constantly. Hundreds of calls came in. Someone saw two boys matching their description at a rest stop in Pennsylvania. Another caller claimed to have seen them in a car with an unidentified man. A psychic called to say she'd had a vision the boys were near water. Every single lead was investigated. Every single one led nowhere. The disappearance of David and Donald Hicken sent shockwaves through Syracuse. This wasn't supposed to happen here. Not in their city. Not at a school where parents paid premium tuition specifically for safety and security. Enrollment at Oakmont Academy plummeted. By the following school year, nearly 40% of families had withdrawn their children. Some parents formed carpools, refusing to let their kids out of sight. Playgrounds emptied. Children who'd once biked freely around neighborhoods were now kept indoors. Fear had taken root. The scandal rocked institutions beyond the school. Michael Hicken worked as an administrator at Syracuse Memorial Hospital, and the hospital found itself fielding questions from media and the public. Had the kidnapping been targeted because of Michael's position? Was there some connection they were missing? Hospital authorities issued statements, cooperated fully with investigators, but the association alone was damaging. The Hickens were a pillar of their community, the kind of family people looked up to. If this could happen to them, to their perfect, protected boys, it could happen to anyone. As weeks turned into months, the investigation continued, but momentum slowed. There was no ransom demand, no body discovered, no credible witnesses. The boys had simply disappeared. Rachel Hicken's hair began to gray. She was only 32 years old, but grief aged her overnight. She stopped going to church, stopped seeing friends. The only thing that got her out of bed was the investigation. She called Detective Henderson every single day. "Any news?" "Not yet, Mrs. Hicken, but we're not giving up." Michael threw himself into work, which strained the marriage. Rachel saw it as avoidance. Michael saw it as the only way he could keep from falling apart. They were grieving differently, and it was tearing them in two. On the 6-month anniversary of the disappearance, Rachel organized a candlelight vigil in downtown Syracuse. Over 300 people attended. They prayed. They sang. They held photos of David and Donald. But the boys didn't come home. By 1972, the case had officially gone cold. Oh, Detective Henderson kept it on his desk. He kept following up on tips when they came in, and they did, occasionally. A sighting here, a rumor there, but nothing concrete. Nothing that brought them any closer to answers. The file grew thicker. Years passed. The Hickens held a vigil every year on March 15th. Fewer people came each time. The media stopped covering it. Life, as it does, moved on. But for Rachel and Michael Hicken, time stood still. Their house remained frozen in 1971. The boys' bedroom untouched. Toys on the shelves. Clothes in the drawers. Twin beds made with matching Star Wars sheets. Rachel would sit in that room for hours, just waiting. I need to pause here for just a moment. If you're feeling the weight of this story, and I know I am, please take a second to hit that like button. It tells YouTube that this content matters, that these stories deserve to be told, and it helps us reach more people. And honestly, knowing that you're invested in seeking justice for victims like David and Donald, that's what keeps this channel going. Okay, let's continue, because as heartbreaking as this gets, there is a break in the case, but it takes 13 years. March 1984, 13 years after David and Donald Hicken vanished. Detective Robert Henderson is now 51 years old. He's grayer, heavier, worn down by years of cases that gnawed at him. But the Hicken case, that one never left his desk, never left his mind. Every March 15th, he'd pull out the file, review everything, see if fresh eyes revealed something he'd missed. He'd made Rachel Hicken a promise in 1971, "I will never close this case." And he'd kept that promise. But Henderson was also a realist. Without new evidence, without a witness, without a body, the case was stuck in permanent limbo. And then, on March 20th, 1984, his phone rang. Henderson. Detective. This is Sheriff Paul Martin from Onondaga County. I've got something you need to see. If you need to see Hauping Martin to %, it is also friend of like descent. Was it his writing able to dating extrants? 20 minutes outside Syracuse, in a rural area dotted with farmhouses and cornfields, a property was being prepared for sale. The owner, an elderly woman named Margaret Gregg, had passed away in February. Her estate was being settled, and the property needed to be surveyed before it could be listed. A survey crew had been walking the land when one of them noticed something odd. An area behind an old barn where the ground had settled unevenly. It looked like a depression, as if something had been buried there, and over time, the earth had collapsed into the void. They'd called the local sheriff. Sheriff Martin had brought a team out to investigate. They'd started carefully excavating, and 3 feet down, they'd found bones. Small bones. A child's skeleton. Detective Henderson drove out to the farmhouse immediately. The scene was cordoned off with police tape. Forensic anthropologists were carefully extracting remains, photographing every step of the process. Henderson stood at the edge of the grave, looking down at the small bones being revealed. He knew. Even before DNA testing, even before dental records were checked, he knew. The forensic team worked through the night. By morning, they had preliminary findings. Male child, approximately 6 to 7 years old, at time of death. Buried for significant period, over a decade, based on decomposition and soil samples. Dental records were rushed to a forensic odontologist. On March 22, 1984, the identification was confirmed. Donald Hicken. Making that call to Rachel and Michael Hicken was the hardest thing Detective Henderson had ever done. After 13 years of hoping, of praying, of believing that maybe, somehow, their boys were out there alive, one of them was dead, had been dead, likely, since shortly after the abduction. Rachel's scream could be heard through the phone. Michael had to take over the call. His voice was hollow, empty. "What about David?" "We're still looking, Mr. Hicken. But now we have a direction. We will find answers." Henderson meant it, because finding Donald's body had given them something they'd never had before. A location. And locations have owners. The farmhouse where Donald Hicken's remains were found had belonged to Margaret Gregg. She'd owned the property since 1952, lived there alone after her husband died in 1968. By all accounts, she was a quiet woman, kept to herself. No criminal record, no connection to the Hickens that anyone could find. But she had family, a grandson, Marcus Gregg. Marcus Gregg, age 41 in 1984, unmarried. Lived alone in a house in Syracuse. Worked various odd jobs over the years, maintenance work, mostly janitorial positions, nothing steady. And in 1971, Marcus Gregg had been 28 years old and employed as part of the maintenance staff at Oakmont Academy. Detective Henderson felt his pulse quicken when he read that. Marcus Gregg had access to the school. He'd been there the day the twins disappeared. He would have known the layout, the routines, the security gaps. And he had a grandmother with a remote farmhouse, perfect for hiding 2 kidnapped boys. Background checks revealed more troubling information. Marcus had been fired from a previous job at an elementary school in 1969 for inappropriate conduct. The details were vague, but it involved him being found in areas where he shouldn't have been, spending too much time watching children on the playground. He'd been let go from Oakmont Academy in 1972, less than a year after the Hicken twins vanished. The official reason was budget cuts, but former staff members told police that Marcus had made people uncomfortable. Nothing concrete, just a feeling. You know how some people just set off alarm bells? Marcus Gregg was one of those people. But in 1971, no one had thought to seriously investigate him. He'd been interviewed like all staff members, but he'd had an alibi, said he'd been working in the boiler room during the time the boys went missing. No one could contradict it. Now, 13 years later, with Donald's body found on his grandmother's property, Marcus Gregg moved to the top of a very short suspect list. Surveillance began immediately. Detectives watched Marcus's house, followed him to work, documented his movements, and while they watched, they built their case for a search warrant. On March 23, 1984, at 6 a.m., that warrant was executed. 12 officers surrounded Marcus Gregg's modest 2-story house on the east side of Syracuse. Detective Henderson knocked on the door. Marcus answered in a bathrobe, confused. "What's this about?" "Marcus Gregg, we have a warrant to search these premises in connection with the 1971 disappearance of David and Donald Hicken." At the mention of the twins' names, Marcus's face went white, and that's when Henderson knew they had their man. The search team spread through the house systematically. Kitchen, living room, bedrooms, bathroom. Everything seemed normal. Shabby, maybe. A bit cluttered, but normal. Until they reached the basement. The basement appeared to be a typical unfinished space. Concrete floor, stone walls, water heater in the corner, storage boxes stacked along one wall. But Officer James Crawford noticed something odd. Behind the boxes, there was a seam in the wall, like a door had been plastered over, but not quite perfectly. "Hey, Henderson, you need to see this." They moved the boxes. Sure enough, a door frame, filled in with drywall and painted to match the surrounding wall. Recent work, by the looks of it, maybe a few years old. Henderson's heart hammered in his chest. "Get this wall open. Now." 2 officers grabbed sledgehammers. The first blow cracked the drywall. The second punched through. The third revealed a dark space beyond. Henderson shined his flashlight through the hole. And there, curled in the corner of a small hidden room, was a young man, emaciated, pale, blinking against the sudden light like a creature that had lived underground its entire life. "Please," the young man whispered. "Please, don't hurt me." David Hicken was alive, 19 years old. Though he looked much younger, malnourishment had stunted his growth and development. He'd been in that basement room for 13 years. 13 years. Let me just take a breath here. I've covered a lot of cases on this channel, but this one, the moment David was found, I still get chills. If you're feeling this too, if this story is hitting you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and rate this story out of 10. How does it compare to other cases we've covered? Your engagement means everything, and it helps me understand what cases resonate most with you. David was immediately rushed to Syracuse Memorial Hospital, ironically, the same hospital where his father worked. Rachel and Michael Hicken were called. They arrived within 20 minutes, running through the emergency room doors like their lives depended on it. Which, in a way, they did. Seeing David again after 13 years. Rachel collapsed. Michael caught her, tears streaming down his face. David didn't recognize them at first. He'd been 6 years old when he was taken. His memories of his parents were fragmented, dreamlike. But Rachel knew her son. She could see it in his eyes, in the shape of his face. Even though he was gaunt and traumatized and so different from the little boy she'd kissed goodbye in 1971. "David," she whispered. "David, baby, it's Mom. You're safe now. You're safe." And David, who had been kept in darkness and silence for over a decade, who'd been told his parents were dead, who'd been fed lies and manipulation and fear, David started to cry. Meanwhile, back at the house, Marcus Gregg was being arrested. As officers cuffed him, Detective Henderson had one question. "Where's Donald?" Marcus looked at the ground. I didn't mean for him to die. It was an accident. He got sick, and I didn't know what to do." "And where is Donald?" "My grandmother's farm. Behind the barn. I buried him there. By Creef, my buried him there. By Creef, my grandmother's farm. By buried him there. My grandmother's farm. By grandmother's farm. My grandmother's farm. My grandmother's farm. My grandmother's farm. My grandmother's farm." Henderson already knew this, but hearing Marcus confirm it, hearing him admit what he'd done, it took every ounce of professionalism Henderson had not to slam the man against the wall. Instead, he read him his rights and loaded him into the police car. As they pulled away, neighbors came out of their houses. Confused. Shocked. Marcus Gregg? The quiet guy who lived down the street? He'd had a kidnapped child locked in his basement for 13 years? How was that even possible? Over the next several days, the full horrifying truth emerged. Marcus Gregg confessed to everything. Not out of remorse, investigators noted that he showed remarkably little emotion, but because, as he put it, "I finally have someone who understands what I was trying to do." Spoiler alert, no one understood. because what he'd done was monstrous. Marcus had been working at Oakmont Academy for about 8 months when he first noticed David and Donald Hicken. He became fixated on them, watched them during recess, studied their routines. He later told police that he saw them as special, pure, worthy of saving. Saving from what? Marcus's explanation was incoherent. Something about the corruption of the modern world, about how children were being destroyed by television and permissive parenting. He'd convinced himself that taking the boys, isolating them, controlling their environment was an act of mercy. On March 15, 1971, Marcus had been working in a maintenance shed near the parking lot. He watched the students file out of the building at the end of the day. He saw David and Donald walking toward the pavilion, and he acted. Marcus called out to the boys, told them their mother had sent him to pick them up. There'd been an emergency at the hospital where their father worked. The boys hesitated. They'd been taught not to go with strangers. But Marcus wasn't a stranger. They'd seen him around the school. He wore a school uniform. He seemed safe, and he was an adult giving them specific information about their parents. Why would he lie? So, they went with him. Marcus led them to his car, parked in an area behind the maintenance building where no one would see. He told them to get in. They did. And he drove them to his grandmother's farmhouse, 20 miles outside the city. Margaret Gregg, Marcus's grandmother, was 78 years old in 1971. She lived alone. Her hearing was failing, and she rarely left the main house. Marcus had been visiting her regularly for years, helping with chores and repairs. She trusted him. Behind the barn, there was an old root cellar, an underground storage space that hadn't been used in decades. Marcus had been renovating it, or so he told his grandmother. In reality, he'd been preparing it. He'd put in 2 small beds, stockpiled canned food, installed a lock on the outside of the door. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. Marcus had been planning this. David and Donald were kept in that root cellar for months. Cold, dark, damp. Marcus brought them food and water irregularly. Sometimes he'd forget for days. Sometimes he'd visit daily, sitting with them, trying to teach them his warped version of morality and discipline. The boys were terrified. They cried for their parents, begged to go home. Marcus told them their parents were dead, killed in a car accident. He was all they had now. Donald, the fearless twin, never stopped fighting. He screamed, tried to escape whenever Marcus opened the door, hit, kicked, rebelled constantly. David, the cautious one, learned quickly that compliance meant slightly better treatment, more food, less punishment. The dynamic that had defined them as twins, Donald's boldness and David's caution, took on a darker significance in captivity. In late summer of 1971, Donald became ill. The root cellar was no place for children. It was cold. Even in summer, mold grew on the walls. The air was stale and damp. Donald developed a cough, then a fever. David begged Marcus to get help. Please, he needs a doctor. He can't breathe right. But Marcus couldn't take Donald to a doctor without revealing what he'd done, so he did nothing. He brought cold medicine, children's aspirin, useless remedies for what was likely pneumonia. Donald died in early September, 1971, less than 6 months after being taken. He was 6 years old. Marcus told police that he'd panicked. He didn't know what to do with the body. He couldn't report it, couldn't explain it. So he buried Donald in a shallow grave behind the barn in an area his grandmother never went. And he told David that his brother had gone to a better place. David, age 6, traumatized and isolated, had no choice but to believe it. With Donald gone, Marcus became even more focused on David. He moved the boy from the root cellar to a small room in his grandmother's house, still locked, still imprisoned, but slightly less hellish. When Margaret Gregg asked about the boy, Marcus told her he was the son of a friend who died, and he was helping out temporarily. Margaret's declining mental state meant she didn't ask many questions. David remained at the farmhouse until 1975, when Margaret's health deteriorated to the point where she needed live-in care. Marcus couldn't risk someone discovering David, so he moved him again, this time to the basement of Marcus's own house in Syracuse, the hidden room that would be David's prison for the next 9 years. 13 years. David Hicken spent 13 years as a prisoner, from age 6 to age 19. His entire childhood, adolescence, and entry into adulthood happened in captivity. Psychologists who evaluated David after his rescue struggled to comprehend how he'd survived not just physically, but mentally. Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the therapists who worked with David, later said, "The human mind is remarkably resilient, but it's also adaptable." David's reality was that room. That was his entire world. He had no frame of reference for anything else. Marcus had provided him with minimal education. Some books, a radio. Eventually, though Marcus controlled what stations David could listen to. No television, no newspapers, no contact with anyone except Marcus. David grew up believing the world outside was dangerous, that his parents were dead, that Marcus, despite everything, was protecting him. It's called Stockholm Syndrome, but it's more complex than that. When you're 6 years old and every authority figure you've ever known has been stripped away, when your entire survival depends on one person, your brain does what it needs to do to survive. The conditions David endured were horrific. Malnutrition Marcus fed him, but not adequately. David's growth was permanently stunted. Social isolation, 13 years without meaningful human connection. Psychological manipulation, constant lies about the outside world, about his parents, about his worth as a person. Medical neglect. David developed dental problems, vision issues, all untreated. And yet, somehow, he survived. When David was found in 1984, he weighed 93 pounds. He couldn't tolerate bright light, couldn't process complex social interactions, couldn't remember what his parents looked like, but he was alive, and that given everything was a miracle. The Syracuse community reacted with a mixture of relief and horror when news broke. Relief that David had been found alive. Horror at what he'd endured, and disbelief that Marcus Gregg, a man who'd lived among them, worked alongside them, seemed so utterly unremarkable, had been capable of such evil. Neighbors were interviewed by media. He seemed so normal, they said. Quiet. A little odd, maybe, but harmless. This is the terrifying truth about many predators. They don't look like monsters. They look like everyone else. Marcus Gregg wasn't a Hollywood villain. He was a lonely, middle-aged man with a job and a house and a grandmother he visited on weekends. And he destroyed multiple lives without anyone noticing. Before we get to the trial, I want to ask you something. How would you rate this story so far? Out of 10, how compelling is this case? Drop your rating in the comments. I read every single one, and it helps me understand what resonates with you all. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We post cases like this regularly, stories that need to be told. Hit that subscribe button. You won't regret it. All right, let's talk about justice. Marcus Gregg was charged with kidnapping, second-degree murder, false imprisonment, and child endangerment. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence. Marcus's confession, Physical evidence from both locations. David's testimony, though prosecutors were careful about how much they asked from him, given his psychological state. Marcus's defense attorney tried to argue diminished capacity, claimed Marcus had delusional disorder, that he genuinely believed he was helping the boys. The jury didn't buy it. On November 3, 1984, after just 4 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict: guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later. The courtroom was packed. Media, curious onlookers, members of the Syracuse community who'd followed this case for 13 years, and the Hicken family. Rachel Hicken gave a victim impact statement that left hardened reporters in tears. She talked about the moment she realized her boys weren't at school, the 13 years of not knowing, the vigils, the hope that slowly died with each passing year. She talked about finding out Donald was dead, about the grave behind a barn where her son had been buried like trash. And she talked about David, the miracle of his survival tempered by the tragedy of what had been stolen from him. "My son is alive," Rachel said, her voice breaking. "But the boy I kissed goodbye in 1971, he's gone." Marcus Gregg killed that boy just as surely as he killed Donald. David survived, but he'll never get those years back. He'll never have a normal childhood, never have those memories, never be who he might have been. 1. Michael Hicken's statement was shorter, angrier. "You took everything from us," he said, staring directly at Marcus Gregg. "Our sons, our peace, 13 years of our lives spent in agony. And for what? Your twisted delusion? Your sick fantasy? I hope you spend every day for the rest of your life in a cell, knowing what you've done." Marcus Gregg showed no emotion during either statement. He stared straight ahead, blank-faced. When given the opportunity to speak, he declined. The judge sentenced Marcus Gregg to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On the murder charge alone, he could have faced the death penalty, but New York had suspended capital punishment in 1963, and it wouldn't be reinstated until 1995. So, life in prison. Marcus Gregg was transported to Attica Correctional Facility, where he remains to this day. He's now 82 years old, still alive, still incarcerated. He's never expressed remorse, never fully explained his motivations beyond the incoherent rambling about saving the boys. Some monsters are incomprehensible. Marcus Gregg is one of them. David Hicken's road to recovery was long and is, in many ways, still ongoing. In 1984, he was placed in intensive therapy, physical rehabilitation to address the malnutrition and neglect, psychological counseling to help him process 13 years of trauma. Reintegrating into society was overwhelming. David had to learn how to interact with people, how to navigate a world that had changed dramatically since 1971. Technology, fashion, social norms, everything was different. Rachel and Michael were patient. They'd waited 13 years to get their son back. They could wait however long it took for him to heal. But it was hard. David had no memory of being their son. He was essentially a stranger who happened to share their DNA. Building that relationship took years. Reports from the late 1980s and early 1990s indicate that David made significant progress. He earned his GED, attended community college for a while, though the social aspects remained difficult. He underwent extensive therapy, including treatment for PTSD, anxiety, and the complex trauma of prolonged captivity. He learned to live independently, eventually moving into his own apartment with support services. And, perhaps most importantly, he worked to remember Donald. David's memories of his twin brother were fragmented snatches of moments from when they were 6, mixed with the trauma of watching Donald die in that root cellar. But Rachel helped him. She shared photo albums, told stories, helped David understand who his brother had been. They visited Donald's grave together. He'd been given a proper burial in a Syracuse cemetery after his remains were released by investigators. David placed a toy T-Rex on the headstone. The Hicken family chose privacy after the trial. They didn't do interviews, didn't write books, didn't capitalize on their tragedy. They just lived. Rachel and Michael stayed married, though friends said the ordeal had changed them fundamentally. Some wounds don't heal. They just become part of who you are. Michael passed away in 2003 from a heart attack. He was 66. Rachel still lives in Syracuse. She's 83 now. And David? He maintains his privacy, which he has every right to. Reports suggest he's as well as can be expected, given everything. He has a small circle of people he trusts. He works. He lives quietly. He survived. And sometimes, in cases this dark, survival is victory enough. The case had broader implications, too. Oakmont Academy implemented sweeping security changes, background checks for all staff, stricter supervision protocols, updated pickup procedures. These changes rippled through schools across New York and eventually nationwide. The idea that a staff member could abduct children from school grounds in broad daylight prompted a complete reevaluation of school security. In some ways, David and Donald Hicken's case changed how we protect children in educational settings. It's a small consolation, but it's something. Detective Robert Henderson retired from the Syracuse Police Department in 1991. He gave one interview before he left, and he talked about the Hicken case. "Some cases stay with you," he said. "This one. I think about those boys every day. I think about the promise I made to Rachel Hicken in 1971. It took 13 years, but we kept that promise. We found them. We got answers." The reporter asked, "Was it worth it? After 13 years? After everything that happened?" Henderson was quiet for a long moment. "We saved David's life. If we'd closed that case, if we'd given up, David would still be in that basement, or dead. So yes, it was worth it." Henderson passed away in 2008. He was 75. His obituary mentioned many accomplishments, but those who knew him said the Hicken case was what he was most proud of, because he'd kept his promise. The case of David and Donald Hicken reminds us of several painful truths: that evil can hide in plain sight, that the people we trust with our children aren't always worthy of that trust, that some victims survive and some don't, and there's no justice in which ones make it and which ones don't. But it also reminds us that persistence matters, that investigators who refuse to give up can make a difference, that even after 13 years, even when all hope seems lost, sometimes there are answers. David Hicken lost 13 years of his life, lost his twin brother, lost his childhood, but he survived, and Donald Hicken, who died at age 6 in a dark root cellar, is remembered, not just as a victim, but as a little boy who loved dinosaurs and was fearless and made his brother laugh. That matters. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. I know this was a heavy one. These stories aren't easy to tell, and they're not easy to hear, but they're important. Do me a favor, drop a comment below. Rate this story out of 10. Tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing this community span the globe. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. We cover cases like this every week, giving voices to victims and seeking truth in the darkest corners. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. And remember, the best way to honor victims is to make sure their stories are never forgotten. I'll see you in the next one.